Good evening and welcome to Holy Family. As we begin, I invite all to join in singing number 399, Christ Be Beside Me. That's 399.
Welcome everyone to our Lenten mission here at Holy Family, and welcome to you who are watching at home. Tonight we have a special guest speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Reichert. She is the Assistant Professor of Moral Theology at St. John's Seminary, a graduate of the Franciscan University of Steubenville. She holds an MA from Fordham University in Religious Education with a concentration in Education for Peace and Justice. She later earned a Pontifical Bachelor's in Theology from the University of Navarra in Pamplona, Spain, and then a licentiate and doctorate in moral theology from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome. While in Rome, she worked at the Markets, Culture, and Ethics Research Center, which focuses on Catholic social teaching with special attention to business and economics. She also worked with the Pontifical Council of Justice and Peace to make a more accessible version of the Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching called the Handbook of Catholic Social Teaching. Dr. Reichert has taught ethics and moral theology at a high school in New York City, business schools in Spain and Italy, and pontifical universities in Rome. She's also taught courses in Catholic social teaching for religious educators in America and in Europe, priests and religious around the world dedicated to combating human trafficking, and the doctors and nurses of Casa Sollievo, the hospital founded by Padre Pio. And without further ado, I give to you Dr. Elizabeth Reichert.
Thank you, Father Andrew. Thank you, Father Albert, for hosting. And where's Dawn? I lost Dawn. I want to thank Dawn for organizing this Lenten mission. And I was so impressed by her and the education formation team and their wisdom in structuring this Lenten mission. I noticed that you had talks already, I think, on holiness and on prayer. And maybe for some people, a talk on Catholic social teaching or on social justice might seem a little bit out of place in a Lenten mission where you focused on holiness and prayer. And if that seems out of place, I think it's because for many people, there's a temptation to view the church as a divided church, to have a church where we have the prayer warrior Catholics and the social justice warrior Catholics. A church of Catholics who love smells, bells, incense, daily mass going, rosary praying, Eucharistic adoration loving Catholics, and Catholics who are changing structures and social organizers and the defender of the poor and the vulnerable and the immigrant Catholics on the other hand. But this division among Catholics is incompatible with the gospel. I'm a moral theologian. And when people came to Christ and asked him to summarize the law, to summarize Christian moral teaching, he summarized it in the twofold commandment of love of God and love of neighbor. And I think it's important that we remember that the church uses the word twofold, not even two commandments, but it's one commandment with two aspects, that we can't separate the love of neighbor, Catholics, and the love of God, Catholics. Because we can't pretend to love God if we are blind to the needs of our neighbor. Christ said, "This is how you will be judged on the last day. Whatsoever you have done to the least of these, you have done to me." And at the same time, if we want to better love our neighbor, we need to know the love of God, be transformed by the love of God, and love them with the love of God. When I came here about maybe a month or so ago, Father Andrew gave me a tour of the parish. I didn't grow up in California. I've lived here for 3 years now. And so it was my first time coming to the parish. And it was beautiful because he showed me around the campus. But one of the first things he said about this parish community was he spoke with such pride about your love for the poor, about your outreach to the poor and outreach to the community, that you do this well as a parish. And I have to admit, I'm a little bit intimidated to come and speak to this community, right? It's like preaching to the choir. Like, I'm reading about this in books, and you're out here living this. And so for that reason, I think I'm going to focus on the gospel, right? It's always good, no matter where you are in your faith or your practice of the faith, to return to the gospel. I always tell my students of Catholic social teaching that I don't like teaching Catholic social teaching, and they're kind of shocked, like, you don't even like teaching the class that we have to take. And I tell them why I don't like teaching Catholic social teaching is because it's uncomfortable. Because every year I teach this course, I go back and I read the documents of the church that she's written on Catholic social teaching. And I have to examine my life. I have to measure my life against these documents. And every year I make changes. I see some other area in my life that's not measuring up to the gospel, and I make a change. And then next year I teach it again, and I read those same documents, and I find another area of my life that doesn't measure up to the gospel. And it's uncomfortable because it challenges me. But this is both the challenging and the beautiful thing about the Christian faith is that we as Christians, we don't compare ourselves to others. We don't measure our holiness, we don't measure our good works by how do we compare ourselves to those on TV or our neighbors down the street. We compare ourselves to Christ because we are called to be imitators of Christ. So we measure up, how does Christ love and how am I loving? That's always our comparison. And so tonight I'm going to look at the principles of Catholic social teaching, but in light of the gospel, specifically in light of the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. This is a Lenten mission. We're in Lent. And so look at social teaching principles in light of Christ's passion and his love for us on the cross. For those of you, I'm guessing some of you have some familiarity with Catholic social teaching. There are different lists of what the principles are. In the church documents, out of all the principles that she comes up with, she says there are 4 major principles of Catholic social teaching. So the 4 big ones are human dignity, the common good, solidarity, and subsidiarity. And so the talk tonight, fittingly, is focused on human dignity. And the church says the entirety of Catholic social teaching revolves around the principle of human dignity. Every other principle we look at is just a further articulation or elaboration of the principle of human dignity. So because of the principle of human dignity, we believe that God wills that every person flourishes, that we don't leave somebody out. And so then the common good says, how do we structure society that enables people to flourish? And then solidarity looks to me then, what am I contributing to society? What am I doing to help other people to flourish? And then subsidiarity tells us something about how we go about this task of solidarity, of helping each other. That was the quick overview. We're going to go through each of these. So we're going to look at a principle. We're going to connect it to some aspect of Christ's passion to bring it into the context of this Lenten mission. And then I'm going to give you kind of a take-home challenge. Because another one of the temptations that happens with Catholic social teaching is to get really focused on big picture things that we have no control over. It is important to think about these questions. It's important to think about these questions simply to think rightly about them. It's important because it might affect the way that we vote. But the temptation is to spend too much time and anxiety and worry on things that we have no control over, things that are outside of our sphere of influence, or to focus on all of the evil that seems out there in the structures of the world, rather than the things in our very own hearts that need to change. So the idea here is to give you something that you can kind of take home and examine in your own life and in your own heart. So let's start with the first principle, the principle of human dignity. The idea of dignity is not an invention of the Christians. It's not an invention of the Jews. The idea of dignity was already present in the Greek culture, but it was a very different idea of dignity. For the Greeks, only a certain group of people could have dignity. That was Greek men, free men, and then men who had performed heroic tasks. So women, young people, slaves, foreigners, none of these people could have dignity. And then even among those free Greek men, only those who had lived a heroic life of virtue could have dignity. The Christian view flips that view on its head. It says everyone has dignity, just in virtue of being a human being. But precisely because you have dignity, you are called to live a life of heroic virtue, to live a life that is befitting of that dignity. The Catechism, in its treatment of human dignity, points to 2 things in Scripture that show that, yes, each person has human dignity. The first thing the Catechism points us to is the fact that we are created in the image of God. So like the concept of dignity, this isn't a Judeo-Christian invention. The idea of someone being made in the image of God was already present in the Mesopotamian culture and also in the Egyptian cultures. But in these cultures, the only person who was made in the image of God was the king or the pharaoh. What was absolutely unprecedented is the idea that every single person, male and female, is created in the image of God. And so this presents us with the idea of a radical equality in dignity, male, female, anything else you can add, right? Sex, religion, race, etc. All of these are accidental. Every single one of these people is equal in dignity. The second thing that the church points us to, so first, image of God. The second is the passion of the Christ. The fact that Christ died for every single person and invites every single person to share in his divine life with him. And so the Catechism tells us, it teaches us that we need to begin to see every other person as a person for whom Christ died, as a brother or sister that Christ wants to enter into communion with us. I think that in our society, I see a lot of hope that we have come a long way from where most societies were in the past of recognizing the dignity of all people. We still have work to do, but we've come a long way in recognizing the dignity of men and women both, recognizing the dignity regardless of their race, regardless of their religion, perhaps regardless of their physical abilities. I think in our society today, perhaps we have some work to do when it comes to age, maybe recognizing the dignity of the child who is only a few weeks old in his or her mother's womb, or perhaps recognizing the dignity of the elderly, who maybe we feel like are a burden on society. But in general, I feel it's a sign of great hope that our society is moving in the right direction of recognizing the dignity of all. But what I want to invite us to do is to be challenged by this idea of Christ, right? This idea that our dignity is rooted in Christ dying for all. So I want to read you a short section from the Passion of the Christ in the Gospel. So this is from the Gospel of Luke. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him." But they all cried out together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, a man who has been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder." Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they shouted out, "Crucify, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no crime deserving death. I will therefore chastise him and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified. And their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave sentence that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, whom they asked for. But Jesus he delivered up to their will. And when he was crucified, 2 others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place which is called the Skull, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on the right and one on the left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." I have found in my own life that it is easy to love those that we see as victims. It is easy to love perhaps those that are distant from us. There's this Italian film I love called Se Dio Vuole, and the mom in this film, she's constantly adopting children. You know, like when you adopt a child from another country, you send them money to support them, and every week she comes home and she has another child up on the refrigerator, and she knows their name and their story, and she can tell you all about them. But she doesn't know what's going on in her children's lives, or she doesn't want to talk to her husband, right? Because sometimes it's easier to love those who are distant and far away, and not those who are close to us. The Catechism, in its section on human dignity, talks about how this duty to respect and love our neighbor, because everyone has dignity, extends to everyone. And then it explicitly says that this same duty to respect and love our neighbor, to recognize their dignity, extends to those who think and act differently than we do. So again, I think it might be easy for us to imagine somebody else who practices a different religion and say, yeah, I can respect that person. Maybe someone who has a different view of sexuality and lives it differently than I do, but I can say, yeah, I can respect that person. What about your neighbor with the Trump sign in the front yard? Or maybe it's the neighbor with the Biden sign. Or maybe it's the family member who has the opposite view that you have on masks, on vaccines, on boosters. Maybe it's the coworker who won't stop talking about her cat, or the other coworker who takes all the credit for the work you did. Or, again, I'm kind of new to LA, but I'm learning this reality. Maybe it's the person who cut you off on the 405. Or like today, I was doing my civil duty, sitting in the exit lane far ahead of time like I'm supposed to. You get right to where the exit ramp cuts off, and then someone comes flying in and expects you to let them in. And you're like, maybe Maybe they didn't see their GPS, maybe they're like out-of-towners, they didn't realize, but I'm 99.9% sure they're just a jerk who wants to cut me off, right? Impatient. And you think, do I really have to love that person? And then I go back to the gospel of Christ. And I think of the way he loved these people on the cross. Christ had no enemies on the cross except for sin and death. He didn't have personal enemies. I chose this passage because you see Pilate, who didn't think he was guilty, and just because of the pressure of the crowd, he gave in and sentenced Christ to death. You see the people in the crowd who chose a murderer, set free a murderer over Christ. Some of the people in this crowd were the same people who welcomed him on Palm Sunday. Some of the same people had probably been healed by him or had family members healed by him and then chose to release a murderer over him. We know the story of the apostles. Only one of them showed up at the cross. The rest of them ran away. Peter, who he chose to lead his church and said, "Christ, I will go with you to prison and even unto death," hours later denied him. And we see the criminals who did something worthy of death, a crime worthy of death. And Christ loves and forgives them as well. I know growing up, I was always told by my mom or by other people, like with the people you have a hard time with, like, you don't have to like them, but you have to love them. And there's some truth there, right? Even the people that are difficult to love, like I think that means we recognize there might not be like these kind of like warm, fuzzy feelings about them. But I think sometimes we let ourselves off the hook too easily. I don't think Christ was up on the cross. He's like, God, really, this person, like I just healed his mom last week and now he's telling them to free Barabbas. Like this, Jesus, like God's the Father's like, Jesus, you don't have to like them. You just have to love them. Like what would that mean for Christ? Like Christ is like, no, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And he wants them to be in paradise with him. He wants them to be in communion with him. And so my challenge for you, based on human dignity, based on the passion of the Christ, is to think of that person. I think we can all think of who's that person in our life, who's the hardest to love. If you can't think of somebody, just go drive down the 405 and someone will cut you off and it will be that person. And first, pray for that person. Pray to God that he help you to love them the way that Christ loved the people who put him on the cross. And then pray for their salvation. Second, if you want to step this up even more, don't just pray for that person. Do something good for that person. Now, if we're talking about the person you can't stand because you've had so many conversations about vaccines or so many conversations about the president or whatever it is, you don't have to go sit down and talk to them about vaccines. Fine. Totally fine. Do something good for that person, but don't do something good that lets you lord it over them, that just makes you feel superior to them because now you've done something good for them. So either do something hidden, or even worse, ask them for help. Ask them for advice on something, ask them to look over something, ask them to give you something, and give that gift to them. All right, so first principle, human dignity. Our challenge is to not just love those who are far away, but to love those put in front of us who are most difficult to love. All right, second principles, I'm going to put solidarity and common good together. Because as I said, common good is the idea that God wills that each person flourishes. And so we need to organize our societies in a way that makes it easy for people to flourish. Peter Moran, he founded the Catholic worker movement with Dorothy Day. He didn't describe the common good this way, but I think he said a line that's the perfect description of the common good. He said, we need to make societies where it is easy for people to be good. I think of friends who have grown up in impoverished neighborhoods, or I have friends who grew up in Eastern Europe under communism, especially in the Balkans, and after communism, their countries descended into civil war. And so many of them were living through war and through famine, and they felt like they had no choice. If they wanted to put food on the table, your only option was to steal or to get into drugs or weapons trafficking. And so what Peter Moran is saying, we need a society where you don't feel like you're forced to choose between living a good life, like a morally good life, and putting food on the table. A society where you're able to live the virtue of generosity because you have your material needs met and you're able to share them with others. So this is the idea of the common good, this idea that we're going to structure society in a way that enables people to flourish. But then solidarity turns the tables or looks at us. It says, what am I doing? How am I contributing to the common good? Because the common good isn't something that just magically happens on its own. Everyone has a duty to contribute to this kind of society. John Paul II explained it really well. He said that solidarity, and the Catholic understanding of solidarity, is not just some vague feeling of compassion, like solidarity sister, or hashtag whatever the issue is that day. Now, this idea of like sharing hashtags about what's going on in the world is a good first step, because that spreads awareness. We can't care about something or begin to do something unless we're aware that it's happening. And then this idea of a feeling of compassion is another necessary good second step. Unless I feel something for the person who is suffering, unless I see myself in them or see my brother and sister suffering, I'm not going to be motivated to do it. So I need to be aware and I need to feel something. But John Paul II says that's still not yet the Catholic understanding of solidarity. Solidarity means I actually go and do something about it. And in the Catholic understanding, solidarity is described as being a virtue, which means, again, that it's not something that just happens. Or some of us were born with this solidarity gene and some of us weren't. That it is a habit, and it's a habit that we have to cultivate with effort. It's going to take effort. And in this regard, I want to share a story, which might seem a little bit out of place at first, but I'm going to bring it back. I'm going to share the story of Kiara Corbella. Out of curiosity, has anyone heard of Kiara Corbella? All right, this is great. Okay, one person, maybe because I talked about it in class. So we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of Kiara Corbella's death. Her cause for canonization is open, so she's servant of God, Kiara Corbella. And she died in Rome about 10 years ago, as I said. And I had the chance to meet her husband and hear her husband a couple times share the story of his life with Kiara. So he and Kiara met while they were on a pilgrimage. They dated for about 6 years, we'll get into that story a little bit later, and then got married. Shortly after their honeymoon, they found out that Kiara was pregnant. A little bit further on in her pregnancy, she had an appointment, and the doctor told her that her child had a severe malformation. The words they use is, it's incompatible with life. We don't know if your child will make it to birth, and if your child does make it to birth, your child might survive maximum a couple hours, maybe a day. Your child isn't going to live. They asked Kiara and Enrique if they wanted an abortion. They said, no, we want to have as much time as we can with our child. And so they gave birth to their first child, Maria Grazia, and she died within about 30 minutes. They were able to baptize the child, spend time with their child. A couple years later, Kiara and Enrique get pregnant again. A few months into her pregnancy, she goes to the doctor, and they say, your child has a severe malformation that's incompatible with life. So again, they accompany the child. They give birth to their second child, Davide, and he lives for about 30 minutes. They were able to baptize him, spend that time with him. And at this point, they wonder, should we try again? But they went to the doctors, and the doctors said they were two totally unrelated issues. The issues that the children have, we don't know what's causing this. We don't think it's a genetic complication. There's no reason to believe that it will necessarily happen again, but the risk is up to you. And so they prayed about it, and they decided, we want to try this again. So they got pregnant a third time, and Kiara went to the doctor, and they said, your baby boy is healthy. But they discovered cancer in Kiara. At that point, she was able to have a first surgery, but that wasn't enough to treat the cancer. They said, you need another surgery, but your little boy probably won't survive if we go for this treatment. And she said, no, I want to give Francesco, my little boy, a chance at life. So she delayed the surgery until the third trimester. They induced labor. She gave birth to a healthy boy, Francesco. And then they began treating the cancer. But unfortunately, at that point, the cancer had progressed, and you already knew the end of the story. She died within about a year after giving birth to Francesco, so she got to spend a year with Francesco and made a huge impact on the community in Rome at the time because of the way that she and her husband lived that time. And when Francesco shared this story, he talked about living through the death of his first two children. And he talked about how he doesn't try to make sense of it. He's like, I don't think this delights God. I think that God weeps with us when this happened. And he said, but one thing Kiara taught me that she reminded me of when I had a hard time with this is that our primary mission as parents is to do everything we can to set up our children to know God, to become saints, and to end up with God in heaven. And he said, with our first two children, we got to see that task through to the end. Not many parents get to do that. We got to see that task through to the end, and now we have our two children up in heaven interceding for us. But the other part of the story that he told that really struck me was that, so I said that they dated for 6 years before they got married. And that's because Enrique couldn't commit. Kiara, when she met him, she was like, this is my future husband, this is the man I'm going to marry. She felt like God had called her to him. They dated, he was really into her too. They got closer about 4 years in, he broke up with her. Why? He said, I was overcome with fear. I was just sure, I had this fear because I'd never loved somebody like I loved Kiara. And he said, I had this fear that I would marry her, that I would love somebody so much, I would marry them and they would die. And he said, I couldn't live through that. So I walked away. I walked away because I would rather risk not having a life with her than loving somebody that much and losing them. You already know the end of the story, right? So when I met Enrique, you would think he would be this bitter guy who's like, God, I had this fear. You worked with me on this, right? You told me it's going to be okay. I trusted you. I went and I married Kiara. And then exactly what I thought was going to happen happened. But when you meet him, yes, he is a man whose life has been marked by suffering, but he's not a man who is bitter. In fact, he's a man who has great freedom because he lived through what he thought he couldn't survive, because he lived through what he thought would be the worst possible thing. And he said, what happened is living through the death of our first two children with Kiara. Kiara taught me through that time of processing this, that death isn't the worst thing. I had this fear. I thought that death was the worst thing, and I let that rule my life. I was going to walk away from the love of my life because of my fear of death. And Kiara taught me that death is not the worst thing. Is this not the good news of the gospel as Christians? That death is not the worst thing? That death does not have the final word? This is from St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. He says, for this perishable nature must put on the imperishable, and this mortal nature must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? I wear a crucifix. I don't know if any of you wear a crucifix, but I don't know if you've ever stopped to think about how weird that is. Probably because we don't crucify people anymore. Imagine walking around with a necklace with the person you claim to be God hanging with a noose around his neck. Or walking around with a necklace, the person that you claim is God, on an electric chair, and then putting some rhinestones on it and making it pretty. That's really weird. St. Paul recognized this. He said that this is scandal, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles, the fact that we preach Christ crucified. But the reason we walk around with Christ crucified on our necks is because death does not have the last word. because after the death came the resurrection. There is a natural inclination, says St. Thomas, to self-preservation. God created us this way. We share it in common with any living creature, even with plants and with animals. So it's like the most primal in us. And it's a good thing. In fact, we have a moral obligation to preserve our life, to do things to preserve our life and our health. But we can also make this inclination, this desire, all-consuming and sacrifice other human goods for the sake of self-preservation. So like Enrique, where he was going to walk away from love, from this beautiful life that God called him to, from living generously with his spouse and his children because of fear of death, we can tend to do the same. Because every sickness, every bit of pain and discomfort, every blow to our social status, every bit of financial insecurity is like a little foretaste of death. And we want to keep it at arm's length. We don't want to feel any of that. But why do I bring this up in connection to solidarity? Because as I said, solidarity is a virtue and it's something we have to cultivate. It's not something that's just going to happen. And that's going to require a death. If we are so caught up in doing everything we can to preserve our own life, we will be blind to the needs of those around us, and we will find ourselves incapable of being generous to those around us. Christ says, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. He who seeks to save his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it and have eternal life. So unless we die with Christ, we will be sterile. We will be like the grain that just falls to the ground. If we want to be fruitful, we must die with Christ. Now, I think for many of us, it may not be fear of physical death that is keeping us back from solidarity, from being generous, from meeting the needs of our neighbor. Maybe for some of us it is. But I think for others of us, it might be that little death of fear of a blow to our social status, of maybe speaking up at a time in our workplace or even in our churches or in our families when it's time to speak up in defense of somebody or something. Or perhaps it's that financial insecurity. I'm not talking about those who are greatly impoverished. I'm talking about saving up for every possible calamity that could happen. And then once I have all of that in place, then maybe in some future world I will be generous. Or maybe it's just something about physical discomfort. It would be sacrificing going out to eat a little bit more often, or sacrificing getting the latest clothing or some other creaturely comfort, because being generous with others would mean that little death to self. And so here's where this death to self, unlike our biological death, that's something that happens once and done. But this dying with Christ is the work of a lifetime. I think there'll be moments where we feel like I have died with Christ, and then we're not done, and he calls us to die a little bit more. And so there are a million ways that we can begin to die with Christ, so that we'll have that freedom then to live generously with others. But my challenge for you today is simply to do what the church calls us to do in Lent. The church in Lent calls us to do prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. So I'm sure that all of you are already doing this. I know we're getting pretty far along into Lent, and it gets a little bit harder, or you forget about it, or you kind of let go of some of the things that you plan to do. So right now we're in the home stretch, and it's a good time for that renewal. Right, with almsgiving, to ask, how can I be a little bit more generous to those who need me? Look around and find the needs in your community. If you can't find them, I'm sure that your pastors know them. I'm sure that the people who organize all of these outreaches at your parish know people who are in need in your community. And be willing to take a little bit of a hit, a little bit of a death, make a little bit of a sacrifice to be generous in your almsgiving. And the same with your fasting. St. Augustine talks about with fasting and with the virtue of temperance connected with food. He says it doesn't really matter what we eat or don't eat. The point is it the same for me to feast and fast? If my brother invites me to feast, can I feast with him in joy? If my neighbor needs my last piece of bread, can I give it up with joy? Or am I so attached to whatever I eat that I'm not ready to sacrifice it when someone else has that need? And so the practice of fasting helps us to live that little death to self. Again, so we're ready to be detached from food, so when we need to be generous with it, we can. And then finally, the prayer aspect. What I would encourage you to do here is to add gratitude into your prayer if you're not already doing it. St. Ignatius of Loyola, he teaches the examen, which is his version of an examination of conscience, where you kind of review your day. And he says for us to do this at the end of every day, or even twice a day. But St. Ignatius's examen, he says you must always begin with gratitude. If you want to get your relationship with God right, you must begin with gratitude. And why do I bring this up right now? Because this death to self and this generosity that Christ is calling us to is scary. And it's a lot easier when we know that God is on our side. When we know that we have a loving Father who knows the number of hairs on our head, who would not let anything bad happen to us. And so if we begin our prayer with gratitude, even when things are difficult, we can point to the things that are going well in our life, to the gifts God has given us. And when we are more aware of all that God has given us, we are more ready then to be comfortable, to have that freedom to be generous with others. All right, and our last principle that we're going to look at tonight is subsidiarity. One more out of curiosity. I promise if you raise your hand, I'm not going to call on you. How many of you have heard of the principle of subsidiarity? Just curiosity. All right, maybe like 25%, 10%, good. Okay. So usually, if you've heard of the principle of subsidiarity, the definition you typically hear goes something like this, is that we have various levels in society that we can point to. We have like the federal government, the state government, the local government. We have the individual and the family, and between the individual and the family and the government, we have things like church organizations, social groups, community organizations, etc. And so what the principle of subsidiarity is, it's about the organization of what goes on at these different levels. So the basic idea is that we should do things at the lowest level possible, or sometimes the highest level necessary. So what the family and the individual can do for themselves, we should let the family and individual do for themselves. What the local community or the local parish can do for the local community, let them do that. The federal government doesn't need to step in and do what the parents can do for their children. At the same time, there are certain things we know that a family or an individual not only can't do, but shouldn't do. Right? I don't need to be making peace treaties with other countries, or this local parish doesn't need to be constructing freeways or things like that, right? That's more fitting for the federal government level. So again, this is usually the basic definition of subsidiarity that's presented, and I think for that reason, most Catholics I meet aren't super interested in this principle. They're like, okay, this is how we organize society, great, got it, move on, not much to say. This is my favorite principle of Catholic social teaching. I'll get to why in a second. But this principle is so often misunderstood because with what I just outlined, while it's a good working definition and a good working model, it gets at the idea that we practice subsidiarity out of a logic of autonomy and a logic of efficiency. And it's not that the church is opposed to a healthy autonomy or opposed to efficiency. And it's true that subsidiarity does these, but it's not autonomy in the sense of like, government, stay out of my business, let me do what I want. That's not why the church promotes subsidiarity, not this kind of individualistic mentality. Nor does the church propose subsidiarity simply because it's more efficient. It's true that it usually is more efficient to let the local community who knows the needs of a local community do what it can for themselves. The Catechism points us to the church's logic behind subsidiarity. The Catechism, after it gives the definition of subsidiarity, there's a next paragraph that people usually skip over because it seems like it was misplaced, like it belongs in another part of the Catechism, because it's talking about the organization of these levels in society like I just went to. And then it gets to the next paragraph, and it starts by talking about God's governance and God's providence. And it says, God does not reserve to himself all exercise of power. Instead, he entrusts to his creatures the functions that they are capable of performing on their own. It's a little bit abstract. Let's break it down. So God's perfect, yeah? God is omniscient. He's all-powerful. Omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, which means that God could do things for himself, and if he did so, if he did everything himself, it would be perfectly efficient. If God wanted things to be done perfectly and done efficiently, God would do them all on his own. The Catechism says this isn't what God does with us. First, when we look at God's plan for creation, the Catechism says that creation did not spring forth complete from the Creator's hand, but is in a state of journeying. Again, kind of abstract. But what it's saying is that when God created the world, it didn't come out complete. Not because God couldn't finish the job, not because he was incapable, but he willed that the work of material creation be in this process, this journeying back to him, this process of development. And he realized, or he willed, that we be co-workers in this process of the development of creation. And then we see in the plan of redemption, again, God willing the same thing. St. Paul tells us to make up for what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. Make up for what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. Again, kind of like the idea of wearing a crucifix, this Bible verse should be really uncomfortable. What is lacking in the sufferings of Christ? Again, was he not able to finish the job? This isn't the Christian understanding. We aren't making up for what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ because Christ was somehow incapable of finishing the job. It's because Christ wills that we participate in the working out of our own redemption and in the salvation of others. Right? When we talk about grace in the life of the Christian, we say that grace is unmerited. We cannot do anything to earn it. It is always God's initiative and is always a free gift from God. But once we enter into the life of grace, once we are baptized and we become what's called a partaker of the divine nature, we have, the church says, cooperating grace, where God wills that we cooperate with him, that he operates and we operate. And so in God's plan for redemption, again, he could do it all perfectly on his own and all efficiently, and yet he wills that we do something too. That our own salvation and the salvation of others depends in part on me, which is a grave responsibility. But it's also, to me, it gives us unfathomable dignity. That God wants something from me, that he waits for me to give something of my own instead of just coming in and doing it all himself. He thinks that I have something to offer to his plan of redemption. And so what the Catechism says, it says that if this is how God governs us, God who is all perfect, all knowing, and can do everything perfectly himself, wills that we do something on our own, wills that we participate. It says this is our model for our leadership over others. So this is our model not just for the organization of society, it's a model for anyone who is in a position of leadership, to empower those over whom you have authority to give what is their own to give. One of the most beautiful examples I've seen of this, of the principle of subsidiarity in action, was in my time with the Missionaries of Charity. So I spent a summer in Calcutta, India, working with the Missionaries of Charity. And so many beautiful experiences. I worked at the first home that she founded, Kaligat, which is the home for the dying. And I worked at Dayadan, which is an orphanage for people with severe mental and physical handicaps. Many children who were abandoned in dumpsters by their parents and who the Missionaries of Charity took in. But for me, the most memorable day in Calcutta was the day that the Missionaries of Charity took me to see their leprosy center. So leprosy, like we find in the Bible, still exists today. But unlike in the time of the Bible, it is totally treatable today. There is no reason that anyone should die of leprosy today. And those who go in or are doctors to this people, it's not a death sentence like it used to be. The issue, though, where it still exists, especially continents like Africa or countries like India, is that there is still so much social stigma attached to it, and there's not always access to treatment. India has changed some of their laws. In the past, even legally, the people with leprosy were untouchables, the lowest system in the caste system. And they were not allowed to go into public places. They could not walk on city sidewalks. They couldn't even walk on highways or streets. The only place they were allowed to walk was along railroad tracks to avoid having any physical contact with people. And so they have since changed this law in India, but if someone is found to have leprosy, either they don't have access to care, or again, there's still this social stigma and they're usually sent out to walk along the railroad tracks. So Mother Teresa decided to open up a center for lepers right on the railroad tracks, because that's where you could find them. So it's like right in front of the railroad tracks, the cars pass by. And you go to the Leprosy Center, and the first thing, if you're a leper, you present yourself there, the Missionaries of Charity do is, of course, they welcome you and they treat your wounds, right? They stop the progression of the disease. So they can stop the progression of the disease, but if you have already lost fingers or hands or other limbs, you don't grow those back, and you're going to need treatment of those wounds for the rest of your life. So they treat the wounds, but again, they still don't stop there. The Missionaries of Charity offer each of them a job. They have these looms set up, a whole center for weaving. And I'm sure you can picture in your head Mother Teresa, the habit that they wear, the famous blue and white sari with the stripes on it. Every single one of those habits that the Missionaries of Charity wear is made by a leper at the Leprosy Center there. And so what they do is if you're missing fingers, they will find a task that you can do without fingers. If you are missing your legs or part of your legs, they've adjusted the loom so you can sit on the ground and work on the ground. And when I met these men and women who have leprosy, who are working in this leprosy center, it's just so beautiful because first, the Missionaries of Charity did what few people were willing to do, and that was just take them in, love them, and heal them. Right? So they weren't untouchables, they weren't outcasts. But even more than that, they didn't just see them as people in need of a handout. They saw them as people who had something to give. And they gave them a chance to give something through their work. And you could see the pride in their eyes, that they were not just seen as untouchables, they were not just seen as people in need of a handout, but they were seen as people who had something to offer. And so the principle of subsidiarity teaches us that we need to enable people to offer their gifts. It teaches us when we work with the poor, we need to collaborate and work with the poor and not just come in with this kind of white savior complex, like I can do it all for you. Right? So again, the Missionaries of Charity still helped them where they needed help, but helped in a way that also empowered them and enabled them to give. So the challenge here for this principle, of course, we can think about the way we structure our social outreach, our charitable outreach. Are we working with the poor? Are we collaborating them? Are we enabling them? But we can also just think about those around us in our lives. John Paul II has this beautiful quote. It was long before he wrote any of his social encyclicals. When he was a young priest, Father Wojtyła, he wrote in a letter to a friend, he said, "The great achievement is always to see values that others don't see and affirm them. The even greater achievement is to bring out of people the values that would perish without us." And so my challenge to you is to look around and the people in your community Look around to the people you know, and who has untapped potential? Who has a value or something to give that needs to be affirmed or needs to be brought out for the sake of the community? And to extend an invitation. Maybe it's inviting someone to join the church choir. I don't know. I'm sure you'll think of much better ideas than I do. But somebody who needs a value affirmed and a value brought out of them, and invite them to offer that to the community. All right. I'm going to stop there. I've been told that you've had in the past at the mission some time for question and answers, so I'll leave a few minutes if anyone has any questions and answers. And then if not, I'll just leave it to Father Andrew to close with the blessing. So.
Any questions? Raise your hand up, bring it back to you. All right. Oh, we got one.
I have a question.
Mi dica.
It's from a son of a grandparent who was born 60 miles south of Rome.
60 miles south of Rome.
South of Rome, in a village from whence came the most famous, the oldest pope that ever lived, who the Pope of the Social Workers, who was born a few blocks from my grandfather, great-grandfather. And would you know who that pope would be? The social pope, the Pope of the Workers, 1878 to 1903.
You better know this, Father. Leo the 13th.
Exactly, Papa Leo the 13th.
They were supposed to memorize the date of the first Catholic social teaching encyclical.
He knows about St. Augustine. He knows St. Augustine very well. He's a St. Augustine. So the question is, I'm involved in the government, and one of the agencies I sit on is the largest air pollution district in the nation, the South Coast Air Quality Management District. And it involves air pollution. And I feel struggle sometimes in the Catholic Church, and I know the Pope is really behind this, about air pollution and it's as stewards of God's creation. But it's not just what it does to the planet, but what pollution does to people who suffer from respiratory diseases, from asthma, from COPD. I coach soccer. 3 of my kids had asthma this year. Has never been like that. I see the Pope doing something, but I'm not sure what they do in the seminaries, what they do at the Catholic Church, the leaders. I mean, if we don't change very soon, not only will we lose the planet, but more and more people will die prematurely, exacerbation, causation of asthma. How can we help? How can you help? How can I help you, even in the seminary, teaching, bringing people to our agency to show you the studies we do at Cedars-Sinai, at USC, UCLA, and the impacts of this on families, the poor families, and all of us. What is the church teaching in the seminaries about that?
Love the question. Thanks for bringing that. First of all, we should talk after. Second, this is what I'm teaching tomorrow morning in class. So I have my students read sections from Laudato Si, but before that I have them read a section from John Paul II's Centesimus Annus and a section from Laudato Si that quotes Pope Benedict, because so many people think this is a Francis thing, the concern for the environment. And praise God, like Francis is showing concern, but my concern there is that we think that it's just a Francis thing, like it's an optional thing, like it's not part of Catholic social teaching or part of our Catholic faith. And so when you read what John Paul II wrote in Centesimus Annus, in 3 paragraphs, it's a summary of the encyclical Laudato Si. Laudato Si is not saying something crazy or new that wasn't said in the magisterium before. And similarly, Pope Benedict was called the Green Pope. He made Vatican State or Vatican City the first carbon neutral state or nation in the world. Now, it's easy when your nation's like 5 square kilometers or something, but still, I mean, like he was known as the Green Pope because this was important to him. And I love, unfortunately, the difficulty with Francis's encyclical Laudato Si is that it's really long. And I think people like pick it up and they're like, it's so long. So I give my guys, like the cliff notes, like this gets you the main ideas. Because you brought up a couple of good points. So first, if you were to summarize the key idea in his encyclical, it would be integral ecology, or the phrase that he says over and over and over again is everything is connected. So we cannot separate our concern for human ecology, the human person and human nature, from the environment in which the human person lives. He says it's a mistake, for example, to show concern for the least in the environment, to show concern for turtle eggs and not show concern for the embryo in the womb. And at the same time, it's problematic to show concern only for the human being and not concern for the environment. Everything is connected. And as you said, the church is constantly concerned for this, not only because it's part of our duty as Christians towards creation, right? We have dominion over creation, but that's a stewardship, not a domination, not a tyrannical domination. But also because of the preferential option for the poor, because of our concern for the poor. And most often, where there is environmental damage, the humans to suffer the most are the poor. We're going to look at the case of Flint, Michigan tomorrow, and you see the effects of the poor and how this was able to go on, the water crisis, for as long as it did because it affected the poor. There was a Ford factory in the same area. Engine parts were corroding. Water was corroding the engine parts, and they knew that, and they went to the city and they immediately got them new water. And they were willing to let that same water go to the poor in the community. And so often it's the poor to suffer. And so I guess I want to add to that when you said, what are we doing in seminaries, is I am teaching people who are going to be priests. And so what their role is not to be experts in all of these fields. They need to be well informed by these principles, because these are not optional elements of our Catholic faith. And then their role is to guide and form the consciences of the faithful, so that you who are experts in these fields are guided by gospel principles, and then with your knowledge and know-how of the material world and how it works, can help make some real solutions. So I don't expect my men to come up with the perfect ecological plan for solving air pollution in California. But I do expect them to guide the consciences of the faithful so that they will be moved to do this well in their own areas of expertise. So thank you for what you're doing, because that's what you're doing, is living this out and putting it into practice. So thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned Dorothy Day. How did Dorothy Day embody the 4 pillars or principles you mentioned tonight?
I just started reading her autobiography, and so I don't want to answer until I finish, because she has, she even said this about herself, that people love to kind of like co-opt her story and use her to prove whatever point they want to prove. And so I'm afraid to do that without like fully immersing myself in knowing her story better. And she's a fascinating person because her political views changed quite a bit over her life, but her deep radical love for the poor did not change. And I'll just say this is one of the beautiful things we see about the example of the saints, is that the saints who served the poor, it was never disconnected from a love of God. In fact, their love of God drove them to serve the poor with greater conviction. And so I started talking about at the beginning of this temptation to kind of form the social justice church and like the Eucharistic adoration, rosary praying church. But when we look at the saints, that division was never there. And there's a tension, and it's a tension that all Christians have, is that on the one hand, we're kind of like strangers and sojourners. We're pilgrims on this earth because we know that our true home is heaven. And at the same time, we labor with the full duties of a citizen. We work just as hard as anybody else, precisely because our faith motivates us not to work less hard for the building up of the kingdom of God on earth, but to labor with greater passion. And Dorothy Day was a clear example of that, and so are any saints kind of that are considered social justice saints, as they always kept these two things that, yes, are in tension, but never let them be divided, our love of God and our love of neighbor. So I'm sorry I don't have a more detailed answer specifically on the life of Dorothy Day, but...
Thank you very much for your speech, partner. I really connected with what you were talking about at the beginning, where you were saying how each year you go over and look at your spiritual journey and see where it falls short. That's right. Where it falls short. Oh, okay. Sorry. And see where your spiritual journey falls short of the gospel. Of course, that makes me really worried about mine. But that just really hit home with me, because besides being a member here of the Congregation of Holy Family, which I've come to really, really love, I'm a member of a 12-step program outside this, and what they teach strongly is spiritual progress, not perfection. every time you get knocked back down and get a little bit, you pick up, and the journey never ends because you'll never reach that top step. You just keep going until the final day. And you just really resonated with me on that, and all of what you said was phenomenal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thanks for bringing that up. Because we do talk about Christian perfection, and I often say in my fundamental moral theology classes, there's a difference between the idea of Christian perfection and perfectionism. And I think some of the key differences is the perfectionist, it's all or nothing. You are a 10, and 9.9 and everything else below is just not a 10. And in Christian perfection, like you said, it is a journey of a lifetime. A 3.1 is better than a 3.2. Like I made a step forward, I might have made a step back, and now I make another step forward. And then the perfectionist expects to, A, be perfect all at once tomorrow, and to be perfect by their own efforts. And Christian perspective is not only a journey in the work of a lifetime, but something that is impossible to do by our own efforts, but we must be transformed by the grace and the love of God.
Hi. First, I just want to thank you for the talk. I feel renewed now in what has been a very spiritually blah Lent. And my question is really, there's some context, I guess. So there's this petition going around Catholic social media calling on dioceses to provide paid family leave for workers who are pregnant and have given birth, kind of in adherence to these principles of human dignity and subsidiarity. And I'm wondering if you could reflect a bit on what can we do as people who are not in the sort of decision-making power structures of our church to lift up those principles when we see them being maybe not necessarily held up in the way that perhaps the gospel says they should be held up?
Great question. So one of the things I remind our men, so I say, you as priests, of course, you're going to be forming consciences, but also in your parishes and your schools and your organizations, you need to implement Catholic social teaching to the extent available. When I was living in Rome, I got to know how the Vatican offices worked fairly well. And the Vatican has 6 months paid maternity leave, and then a year. You can extend it another 6 months unpaid, but your position will be held for up to a year. And so I think that's a beautiful standard that they're setting. And I guess the two things I can say is, yes, it's difficult when you're not in the decision-making position. I'm glad to know you said this is a petition going around, so you can certainly support the petition. And then this might not work quite as well in the church organizations, but when it comes to a living wage and the church documents, she asked the question, whose responsibility is it to guarantee a living wage and guarantee things like you're talking about here? And of course, the primary responsibility is that of the employer. And then the secondary responsibility would be that of the government, of helping to set certain minimum wage laws, help determine what would be a possible minimum wage. But then what's fascinating is John Paul II talked about the indirect employer. So he says, we, here sitting in the pews who aren't employers, we don't get off scot-free of just saying, well, it's not my fault that, Nike, H&M, whatever the country is, isn't paying a fair wage. I'm just buying their clothes. I didn't make it happen. And he says, no, you can ask yourself, who are you supporting? Right? And so I gave the example of being uncomfortable. This is one of the things over the last couple years I've really been convicted by as I read John Paul II's teaching on a living wage and teaching on the idea of an indirect employer, of saying, to the extent that I'm able, right? It's really difficult to research every product you buy, and I think that would be a mistake of the, misspent time of researching every single product you buy. But you can start with one. I start with one and say, let's learn some companies that I know pay living wage and begin to shop from there. Or the next time I need to buy a pair of shoes, am I willing to pay a few extra dollars or take a few extra minutes to see where it's coming from? So again, that might not work as well in the church organization. So there I think that you can sign petitions, encourage, put pressure. But then when it comes to living wage in general, to not just leave the responsibility on others, but to ask ourselves what we're able to do there to support a living wage as consumers.
One of the things that you touched on lightly that I think there should be more emphasis on is that we're Catholic. And because we're Catholic, we can lead what's called a sacramental life. I mean, we can basically just take the Eucharist and get infused knowledge, because the Eucharist is the body, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. And the thing with the Eucharist, and even what you're talking about, the act of surrender to really make it true. I mean, it is written that if I speak in tongues but I have not love, I am a gong in the wind. So the issue with even Catholic social justice teaching and virtues is they must be prayed for. And once they're prayed for, they must be suffered for. And the suffering is our own suffering because we surrender our egotistic view of what we think a virtue is. And God takes the mirror and holds it to our face, just in Corinthians. For now I look myself squarely, but first in the mirror, and I see myself for who I am. And that creates great suffering. I mean, it's very easy to talk about it. And if it's heady, where we're just thinking about it, it doesn't become a part of our soul because we're mind, body, and soul. It's only the mind executing it. But it needs to be so inebriated in us that it becomes the soul, which is the part that God created, permeating through and being what He wants us to be, not what we think He wants us to be. And that issue with, as we grow closer to Christ, and it's very easy with the Eucharist. I mean, it's kind of like, I call it being holy for dummies, you know. But, I mean, because we do have a sacramental faith. All you got to do is show up, okay? I mean, so that's the thing. It's very easy. We don't need to go to school. We don't need a doctorate in theology. We just need the Eucharist. And the Eucharist will lead us to holiness. And the Eucharist, if we choose to surrender ourselves, and it's a constant act, I agree with you. I don't think we're perfect till we die. Okay, but if we choose to surrender and we see that ugliness, and there's a lot of ugliness every day, like even at Lent, every day, I just think like, how did I create that? When somebody is rude to me, I think, how did I create that? When something happens, and if each of us just did that, I know there's a lot of ego involved. People want to be famous. They want to be Mother Teresa. Who cares? I tell my kids this, they're adult children. I say, be the pebble in the pond, or be the water that goes over the little stone. Allow the living waters of the Holy Spirit to go over the stone and soften you. Because if each of us just worried about being the little pebble in the pond, think of the waves we as a mass community could create. To me, that's the underlying lesson in all of this. And like I said, we've got, being good made easy for dummies, being Catholic. Not that other people can't be holy. I mean, I had a friend recently tell me most of the people that he met that were holy weren't even Christian, and amen to that. I've met that too. So this is the thing. But we've got, every day, we've got a wonderful miracle occurring in the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ. We've got the Eucharist there. Father Albert does a beautiful adoration. There's I've got a key. I use the Adoration Chapel at St. Therese just because that holy hour gives me the peace that I cannot create within myself. So at any rate, that's my 2 cents worth. So I don't worry about what the rest of the world does. I worry about my own soul. And if God wants to change the world, let Him. But this is all I can do is take care of me. And I'm not doing that great a job most of the time, but I do my best to give it to Him. That's it. Okay.
I don't know about 2 cents. I think that was at least a nickel's worth, right? I mean, you're selling yourself short there. No, thank you. That was beautiful. So many things you said really resonated. It reminded me of when you talked about, like not trying to be Mother Teresa or being that pebble. Mother Teresa said something similar to this, so did G.K. Chesterton. There's a story that it came out, I think, in the London Times, asking different people, what is the first thing you would change in the world? Or what's wrong with the world, right? And G.K. Chesterton said, me, like sincerely G.K. Chesterton, or Mother Teresa said, I am the first thing that I would change in the world. So that's why I said, I want to focus on, we spend so much of our time and our anxiety and our worry on things that we have no control over and not focusing on what we need to change in our hearts. And I also like how you talked about this idea of surrender, because there is a sense in showing up for the Eucharist, but there's also a surrender there. Because the church documents say, like, the Eucharist, this isn't their wording, this is my wording. They say the Eucharist is not like a pill, that the efficacy of the Eucharist depends on my disposition. So I do need that surrender. And it is a surrender, right? It's not something that I can get on my own and be transformed by the Eucharist. And this is where I think my other kind of favorite principle of Catholic social teaching, besides subsidiarity, is that the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church teaches the priority of conversion of heart. That only those who have been transformed by the love of Christ are truly capable of transforming society for the better and loving their neighbor. And so our first commitment is, like you said, like that priority of the conversion of our own heart, so that we can better love our neighbor and change society for the better. Thank you for all of that you shared.
Thank you, Dr. Reichert. Round of applause. So I have some good news and bad news. The good news is there's no second collection. The bad news is I do have about a page worth of announcements. I'm kidding. So next Tuesday is the last evening of our 5-part Lenten series called to be Bearers of Light. And our speaker will be Jesuit Father Brendan Bussey of Dolores Mission Church. Father Brendan will share his insights on discipleship, realizing God's kingdom in the here and now. We invite you to come next week for this and join us at, again, 7 p.m. For refreshments, 7:15 here in the church, and enjoy the talk. Thank you for coming. God bless you, and have a good evening.